Imagine a time before anyone knew that death was something waiting for them personally. A time when death was simply a thing that happened to other creatures, something observed from the outside, never once connected to the self standing there watching it happen. For a long stretch of early human history, this is likely how death was understood, if it was understood as anything more than a simple event. Early humans saw death constantly, in the hunt, in the wild, even among their own kind. But seeing death happen to someone else is very different from understanding that death is a personal, unavoidable certainty, waiting somewhere in your own future. The real question is this: when did a human being first look at a death and think, not just that happened to them, but that will happen to me too someday, no matter what I do? That single shift in thought represents one of the most profound cognitive developments in the history of our species. Scientists call it mortality awareness, and it did not arrive instantly. It built up slowly, piece by piece, until the full picture came into focus. The first piece of the puzzle was repetition. Early humans lived in small, tightly knit groups, and over a lifetime a person would witness death many times. A parent would die, a sibling would die, a close companion would eventually die as well. At first, each death may have felt like an isolated tragedy, but as the pattern repeated across every single person a human being ever knew, something inevitable began to take shape. If everyone eventually died, without exception, then this was not misfortune. It was a rule, and if the rule applied to everyone else without a single exception, logic would eventually demand an uncomfortable conclusion. It must apply to the observer as well. This required a kind of abstract, self-referential reasoning that appears to be uniquely powerful in human minds. Scientists call this theory of mind, the ability to model other minds and eventually to reflect on one's own mind as an object of thought. Once early humans could imagine themselves the way they imagined others, the extension became almost unavoidable. If I can picture myself as others see me, I can also picture myself the way I have seen others. Alive and then eventually not alive. The third piece likely came from injury and illness. A deep wound, a raging fever, a serious fall. These moments would have generated raw, instinctive terror long before any philosophical understanding of death existed. This physical brush with near death, or watching someone else nearly die, created a felt, visceral link between danger and the possibility of ceasing to exist entirely. Over time, these threads, repeated observation, growing self-awareness, and personal brushes with danger, wove together into a realization no single event could have produced on its own. Not only do living things die, but I too am a living thing, and therefore I too will die. We can only imagine what that moment felt like for the first humans who fully grasped it. Unlike every death witnessed before, this realization carried no external body to look at, no visible proof. It was entirely internal, a private, invisible earthquake with no ritual yet invented to explain it. No elder to say, "I have felt this too," because there may have been no language yet capable of expressing it at all. Picture a young hunter sitting by a fire after watching an elder die peacefully in sleep. The group grieves in whatever way they understand such moments, but this hunter's mind moves somewhere new, not just grieving the loss, but suddenly imagining their own body in that same stillness, imagining their own breath stopping. This thought would have arrived with no comfort attached, no promise of an afterlife, no belief system to soften it. Just the stark recognition that the self thinking these very thoughts would one day stop thinking anything at all. This is one of the loneliest realizations a conscious creature has ever faced, and it likely developed gradually, across hundreds of thousands of years, rather than as a single dramatic event. The archaeological record shows us what happened once this awareness took hold. Deliberate burial appears roughly 100,000 years ago, becoming far more elaborate from around 50,000 years ago onward. Matching closely with when scientists believe modern human cognition and self-awareness were firmly established. Burial is strong evidence of mortality awareness, specifically because it requires forward-thinking behavior tied to belief about the future. A creature that saw death only as something happening to others would have little reason to develop elaborate burial customs or grave goods. The presence of tools, ornaments, and food placed with bodies suggests belief that death is not simply an ending, but a transition, one the living themselves expected to face one day. Early humans were not only responding to other people's deaths, They were already thinking ahead to their own. Once this awareness took hold, daily life had to change. Before it, humans likely lived largely in the present, the way most animals do. But once death became a personal certainty, waiting in an unknown future, planning mattered in a new way. Teaching your children everything you knew carried urgency, because your own knowledge would disappear with you unless passed on deliberately. Relationships carried new emotional weight, because you understood that everyone you loved, and you yourself, existed on a finite timeline. Researchers believe this awareness may have directly accelerated language, culture, and long-term planning, all of which depend on thinking beyond the immediate present. There is also a harder side to this story. This realization brought real psychological weight, a form of existential dread no human before this point had needed to carry. This is likely why humans developed such rich belief systems around death so quickly, in evolutionary terms. The mind needed a way to make this knowledge bearable. Belief in an afterlife, continuing spirits, or ancestral presence all serve a critical function, whether or not they are literally true. They let a person hold the knowledge of their own mortality without being completely overwhelmed by it. We see hints of this need clearly in the archaeological record. Bodies buried facing the rising sun, as though oriented toward renewal. Bodies painted with red ochre, a color tied to blood and life, perhaps meant to symbolically restore vitality. Bodies buried with tools and food, prepared as though for a continuing journey rather than a final ending. Each practice suggests humans actively reframing death, not as loss alone but as transition, because transition is far easier to carry than a meaningless ending. This same psychological pattern still shapes us today. Modern research shows that when people are reminded of their own mortality, even briefly, their behavior shifts. Some become more committed to their beliefs. Some focus more on legacy, on leaving something behind. Some become kinder, seeking connection in the face of mortality. All of these responses trace back to the same original challenge faced by the first humans who understood that death was not just something that happened to others. Every time a person makes a decision based on how they want to be remembered, every time someone chooses to have children, write something or build something meant to last, they are responding to a pressure first felt by the very first humans who fully grasped their own mortality. Consider, too, how this changed the relationship between generations. Once elders understood clearly that their own death was approaching, knowledge that once might have been shared casually took on new importance. Skills, stories, warnings about danger, all of it needed to be passed along deliberately, because for the first time, elders understood their window for teaching was limited and closing. This urgency likely accelerated the development of oral tradition itself, the deliberate passing of stories and knowledge from one generation to the next. Picture, the first time a parent explained death honestly to a child, not as something that happened only to others, but as something the parent themselves would one day face, and the child too. This conversation, in whatever form it first took, marks the point where mortality awareness stopped being a private, isolated realization and became something taught, shared, and woven into what it meant to grow up human. And yet, in a strange way, every human being alive today still experiences some echo of that original moment. Even children raised within rich cultural traditions designed to explain death often describe a specific moment, usually in childhood, when mortality first becomes truly, personally real, not simply understood as a fact repeated by adults, but suddenly viscerally felt. Each of us, in our own way, still walks through some smaller version of what those first humans experienced. We are told about death long before we understand it. And then, at some point, often without warning, understanding arrives anyway, quiet and absolute, the same way it must have arrived for the very first human being who ever looked at another person's stillness and thought, for the first time in the history of life on this planet, that will be me too. Someday. We often think of major human discoveries in terms of tools or technologies, fire, the wheel, agriculture. But this discovery, quiet, internal, and impossible to date precisely, may be one of the most significant of all, because it did not simply change what humans could do. It changed how humans understood themselves, their place in the world, and the meaning of the limited time they had been given. Every religious tradition, every philosophy, every ritual of remembrance, every work of art created to leave something behind, All of it descends from that first, quiet, terrifying realization that death is not simply something that happens to others. It is something that waits patiently and certainly for every single one of us, and in a strange way, that shared understanding, carried silently by every human being who has ever lived, is one of the deepest threads connecting all of us together. Across every difference of time, culture, and belief, we are the first species on this planet that ever had to learn to live, fully and meaningfully, with the complete knowledge of our own ending. That knowledge, difficult as it has always been to carry, has also pushed us generation after generation toward connection, toward meaning, toward love expressed more urgently because we understood, however dimly, that time was never guaranteed. Knowing that we will not always be here has never stopped us from living as though the time we do have matters enormously. If anything, it may be the very reason we have always tried so hard to make it count.